My name is Eli Mercer, and if you told me when I was in my 30s knee-deep in soil and survey stakes, running contour lines and negotiating right-of-way easements that one day I'd be fighting a small, suburban war over who gets to plant a sunflower in their front yard, I'd have laughed and said, only in this town. But here's the thing. Power doesn't always dress up like a suit or a badge. Sometimes it comes with a clipboard, a smile, and a stack of rules printed in 12-point Times New Roman. It took me 3 cups of coffee and 1 very bad week to learn that the rules can become weapons, and that the quietest neighborhoods can have the loudest fights. Let me tell you what happened at Cedar Hollow, how a perfect little street, with perfect little lawns and perfect little mailboxes, almost ate us alive. When my wife and I decided to move, it wasn't about reinvention. We wanted quiet. She wanted a porch to drink iced tea on. I wanted a yard to grow tomatoes without someone telling me how tall the plants could be. After 20 years of line work, maps, and county courtrooms, I wanted a place where the loudest sound at night would be a dog barking at a raccoon. Cedar Hollow billed itself like that on the listing. Mature oaks, neighborhood association, low turnover, block parties in the fall. It looked like every picture of peaceful retirement you'd ever see. We signed the papers in late spring, packed the U-Haul, and moved into a 2-story that had a mailbox shaped like a barn and a swing on the back porch that creaked just right. It didn't take long to notice the subtle choreography of Cedar Hollow. Mornings were for sprinklers and coffee, afternoons for mowing on a schedule so precise it could be set by atomic clock, evenings for porch lights extinguished at 9:30 sharp. There was an unspoken cadence, until one afternoon a woman with a clipboard stepped on our lawn and the rhythm faltered. She introduced herself as Marlene Avery, tall, hair swept up into a knot that never loosened, a cardigan that whispered elegance. Her smile was practiced, her handshake firm. "Welcome to Cedar Hollow," she said, and handed us a packet thicker than the user manual for our hot water heater. Rules, covenants, restrictions, CCRs, they were called a library of do's and don'ts that read like a litany. Where to put trash bins, the color range allowed for shutters, the acceptable pitch for porch music. I flipped through it and thought, well, okay, a little paperwork never hurt anyone. My wife, Laura, made tea and tried to laugh it off. The first few weeks were still fine. We learned which houses had solar panels and which ones had roses. We met neighbors at a block barbecue and traded pies and recipes. But still, every so often, there'd be a note tucked in our mailbox, a friendly reminder about lawn edging, a suggestion that our bird feeder might attract pests. Friendly, until it wasn't. The notes tightened around us like string, every reminder a small fray pulling at a seam. Marlene was everywhere and nowhere. She attended garden club meetings, sat on the front row at the HOA's monthly gatherings, and always seemed to appear at precisely the moment a question about community standards came up. Her public persona was spotless, concerned about property values, protective of aesthetics, the defender of Cedar Hollow's reputation. Behind the public persona, though, there was a cadence that felt less like stewardship and more like regime. The smile never quite reached the eyes when you disagreed with her. You learn about a person by how they treat small things. Marlene treated small things like tests. She would flag a mailbox that leaned an inch too much, and when the owner took the fix seriously, replaced the post, added a fresh coat of paint, she would stride up and say, "Thank you for your prompt attention," as if she were high-fiving the community itself. It made people feel seen, disciplined, affirmed, and those feelings were addictive. Control became virtue. Accountability became virtue policing. At first I kept my head down. Old habits die hard, but they do in this case in the direction of tolerance. I clipped the hedges on the day the neighbor recommended. I moved the trash can behind the garage by 9 in the evening. I attended one HOA meeting out of curiosity more than anything else, and that's where things began to shift. The meeting room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Paper agendas stacked at the front, a projector humming. I found a seat near the back with a handful of other new residents, people who'd moved in recently and were still getting their bearings. Marlene chaired the meeting with that passionate tone of someone who'd convinced herself she was protecting a legacy. "We maintain value here," she said. "We protect an investment." There were nods. There was applause when she announced a new minor, and I mean minor infraction fine schedule. $25 for the first notice of an unapproved flag, $50 for the second, $100 for repeat offenses. When it came time for open comments, I raised my hand. I said, "We moved here for community, not arbitration. Are fines the only way to encourage compliance?" It was a simple question. It landed like a stone in still water. Marlene smiled and answered quickly, "We couldn't be the exception," she said. "Rules are the backbone." I felt something in the room shift, a tiny pressure change, like the air before a storm. That night we found a note on our door. "Please be mindful of community standards. M.A." It felt less like governance and more like a puncture. That note started a pattern. Later that week, a second note appeared, more specific. "Bird feeder causing droppings on sidewalk. Please relocate." I didn't think much of it until the surveillance camera. Yes, we had one because I always had one in my line of work, captured a silhouette moving along the side of the house in the early hours, checking the latch on the feeder. I shrugged, rationalized it as homeowner checks, until a neighbor texted me. "You saw Marlene out last night," she wrote. Her photo attached showed the same cardigan, same knot of hair. In the picture, Marlene stood on our side yard with a flashlight, peering at the feeder. The timestamp was 3 in the morning. We asked her about it. She told us she'd been making rounds. She claimed she'd noticed an issue and wanted to make sure it was being addressed. Her smile never cracked. But my years mapping property lines taught me one thing. When someone goes searching in the middle of the night, there's usually a reason other than civic courtesy. My surveyor instinct's the part of me that reads a place in layers, sensed a pattern. It was reconnaissance, not concern. She was assembling evidence. We tried to be neighborly, but every attempt felt measured, weighed. We'd bake brownies and catch Marlene's eye from across the lawn, and she'd smile politely, then hand us a new bulletin of rules. Her authority was performative. She wielded it like a scalpel. The crowd clapped when she announced a new enforcement action signage about parking, restrictions on leaf piles. People began to report minor violations of neighbors, sometimes anonymously. Friendships that had been casual suddenly had margins. After a few months, the harassment moved from notes to notices. A formal letter arrived. Violation of Article 4, Section 12, unauthorized outdoor storage. It was for a wheelbarrow I had left in the side yard for a day. The letter demanded corrective action within 7 days, or a fine would be levied. I fixed the wheelbarrow's hiding place and wrote a calm email to Marlene asking for clarification. I received a crisp reply. Cedar Hollow's rules were clear. The board appreciated my cooperation. I kept all correspondence. I laminated the first notice and stuck it in a binder under the tab HOA. That binder grew heavy, filled with timestamps and polite threats, with packets of "for your records." People joked that I was obsessive. I told myself I was being prudent. Documentation is the oldest tool in any disputant's toolkit. Evidence tames the noise of accusation. That's what my work taught me: measure, map, record, and that's what I started doing. Then my back door was found ajar. I had gone into town to run a survey, about 3 hours away, which was normal. Laura was out of town visiting her sister. I returned after a long day to a door swung open, a coffee cup on the kitchen counter where I didn't leave it, a lamp that had been moved. My first thought was burglary. My second thought, slower and colder, was the binder, the evidence, the notes, the times. I called the police. The officers who arrived were polite. They took a report and asked routine questions: any missing items? Signs of forced entry? But the detail that froze me was when one of them asked if we had any neighborhood disputes. These days it's often neighbors, he said, and his tone wasn't judgmental, it was aware. I remembered the silhouette in the photo. I remembered Marlene's midnight rounds. We checked our surveillance footage. It showed a figure slipping up the side of the house at 2 in the morning, pausing to listen, then stepping through the back gate as if the gate was usually unlocked. The figure wore a coat that obscured the face, and the camera angle was grainy. I ran the clip quietly, frame by frame, and my stomach turned. In 2 frames, the figure's profile was unmistakable. The hairstyle, the tilt of the head, the way the cardigan bunched at the arm. It was Marlene. There was no way around it. I took the clip to the police. I took it to my neighbor, Tomas, who'd lived on the street for 20 years and kept an eye on things. Tomas watched the footage with that quiet expression older men get when they're thinking of a past they'd rather not revisit. He said, "She thinks she's entitled to check every corner. It's like she owns the place." Having confirmation changed the tenor of everything. It made the fear sharp. It made the letters threatening. It made the fine notices feel like threats with teeth. I wanted to be measured, to file complaints, to pass documentation to the board, to request formal mediation, but I also wanted to pick up a bat and go knock on her door. I told myself to breathe. I organized the footage. I compiled the emails. I printed the midnight photo and placed it in the binder. When we brought it to the HOA board, they were polite, sympathetic, even but bureaucratic. Their first response was procedural: an internal review, a consultation with counsel, a closed session to protect privacy. The board asked Marlene for a statement. She replied in calm, soap-smooth prose. Yes, she had gone to ensure compliance. Yes, she had been performing an inspection. She insisted she had permission to be on the property for community safety. She framed it as duty. Nobody liked the direction this was taking. People who had always nodded at the board now saw what we saw: the gap between tone and action. The membership called for a hearing. The date was set. Cedar Hollow's small auditorium filled with folding chairs, with casserole dishes, with neighbors bringing lawn chairs and folding chairs, and the faint smell of potluck. In the room, the binder felt heavy in my hands. It was full of a quiet accumulation of offenses, notes, photos, timestamps, proof of a pattern. At the hearing, Marlene arrived like a queen at court. She had supporters, a few board members who found her attention to detail comforting, a couple of neighbors who appreciated her vigilance. They spoke of maintenance, of property values, of the need for someone to steer the community. When it was my turn, I stood and spoke slowly, trying to keep my voice even. This isn't about a bird feeder, I said. It's about privacy. It's about people whose homes were entered without permission. We filed a police report. The surface rules exist to keep things in order, but the order's been weaponized. We have to decide what Cedar Hollow stands for: stewardship or surveillance. Marlene listened with a practiced frown. When her turn came, she spoke about responsibility. She said, "I walk the neighborhood at night because I care. I look out for children, for pets, for hazards. If that makes me unpopular, then so be it. I am protecting value, and I will not apologize for protecting the common good." Her words landed crisp and unapologetic, and I realized how easy it is to conflate caring with control. The room split, not violently, not with shouts, but in glances and in the way friends avoided each other afterward. Lines had been drawn. People took sides like they were choosing seats on a bus. After the hearing, the board issued a temporary suspension on any overnight inspections by board members. They recommended a mediation process. But like a ripple hitting a cliff, the damage had already been done. Gossip spread. Anonymous letters surfaced. People who had been on friendly terms for years now found themselves filling out forms to explain where they kept their trash cans. Trust, which in neighborhoods is fragile enough to begin with, eroded deeper than we ever expected. Marlene's response to the suspension was a quiet escalation. She began to file her own complaints against households who had challenged her. She claimed harassment. She accused me of defamation. She painted herself as the victim of a conspiracy. Her emails to the board were formal and exacting. She attached articles about HOA governance and the legal responsibilities of board members. She spun a narrative in which the community was under attack by a small group who were trying to disrupt order. At some point, the dispute spilled into social media, our own private Facebook group, where opinions turned into arsenals. People who'd never spoken at a meeting now posted long manifestos about rights, about bylaws, about the sanctity of property. New alliances formed. People who had been quiet for years became loud, sometimes to the point of cruelty. We had moved from neighbors to factions. I started to sleep less. Laura worried about the strain it put on our friends and our evenings. She said, "This is not the life we pictured, Eli. You went into property work to solve problems, not to make enemies." I agreed. But solving problems is a messy business when the problem is someone who believes their rulebook is a compass and their compass is the law. The tipping point came one late autumn afternoon. The air had that brittle edge, the kind that makes light look thin and sharp. We had community cleanup day, a potluck that usually proved our shared humanity, and Marlene announced she would be enforcing the parking restrictions that weekend. A neighbor, Maya, a schoolteacher who'd lived here 5 years, had invited friends for a small gathering that spilled into the street. A moving truck was parked at the curb. Marlene sent a notice, violation of parking. Maya argued that it was a temporary situation. The two had words on the cul-de-sac. What followed was ugly and public. Marlene stood on the porch, hands on hips, and accused Maya of being disrespectful. Maya, her voice shaking, accused Marlene of bullying. Voices rose. People took sides. I remember the shock on the kids' faces, teenagers who had never seen their parents in a fight like that. It felt like watching a slow burn become a bonfire. In the chaos, someone filmed the exchange. The clip went around the neighborhood like a match. The next day, heated emails flew in both directions. A faction demanded Marlene's resignation. Another demanded she be reinstated with greater authority. The board scheduled an emergency meeting. It felt less like governance and more like tree-off. Emotions overtook policy. The binding that had once been an innocuous manuscript now read like a scripture that legitimized everything and nothing at once. During that week, I found a letter under our door. No signature. Just, people will choose their side. That's the problem. I kept the letter in the binder. It belonged there now, another piece of the sediment of conflict. I realized then that formal procedures could only take us so far. Rules are neutral on paper. It's the people who interpret them who don't stay neutral. A legal remedy matters, but community is about relationships. I started to think not about legal recourse alone, but about recovering the fragile tissue of neighborliness. So we did something small and not very smart in a way. We organized a block barbecue on a Friday night, the kind where you invite everyone and hope the music drowns out the awkward silences. We went door to door with trays of pulled pork and lemon bars, and we asked people to come. Some declined. Some came with arms crossed like they were bracing for battle. Tomas brought his guitar. Maya showed up with cupcakes. Marlene came, too, with a salad so precisely arranged it could have been a display piece. And for a moment, there was a fragile peace as people ate and exchanged thin jokes. But a moment of peace can't erase months of grievance. The barbecue revealed more than it healed. Two neighbors began arguing about parking again. A comment about property lines became about loyalty. Then, 20 minutes into the gathering, a man pulled up in a truck and parked across two driveways. He'd come from town. He was a friend of Marlene's. He spoke in measured sentences and had a way of saying respect that sounded like a verdict. He took off his jacket and set up a small speaker that played instrumental music with the volume turned to official. The truck had a decal on the door, a logo for a private security company. For the first time since this all began, people saw it, the architecture of force. I felt my own heart pace. This was a signal not just of control, but of escalation. Marlene had allies beyond Cedar Hollow's folding chairs. The next morning, a letter arrived. The HOA had retained counsel. They had advised Marlene to file an injunction against the homeowners who had circulated footage and made public allegations. The legal letters began to stack. She sought a restraining order against any neighbor who had defamed her. My binder grew heavier. I debated my options. I could have retreated, drained the neighborhood of my energy, and walked away. A lot of people chose that path: silence, resignation, moving toward convenience in the name of peace. But the thought of letting a small appointed authority dictate the rhythms of life in a place I loved felt like betrayal. I thought of my grandfather's farm, of the way he trusted neighbors and taught me to trust them back. Some things are worth holding on to, even when it's hard. I decided to push back, formally, but legally. We hired counsel. We filed a complaint about wrongful entry and harassment. The filings were exact, meticulous. There's an intimacy to legal language, a way of turning narrative into elements of proof. The lawyer asked the usual questions. Do we want a public trial or mediation? Do we want an injunction? Do we want an apology? My hand shook when I signed the papers. This was not the civil dispute I ever thought I'd be in at this stage of life, but it felt like the right thing. As things moved toward a hearing before the county's special civil court, Cedar Hollow became a theater. People who'd been spectators now had scripts. The hearing day was clear and cold, an almost comedic contrast to the heat the controversy had generated. We entered the community room not unlike the one at the first hearing, but this time the stakes felt larger. The lawyer's voice was calm, precise. Marlene's attorney was similarly accomplished. The judge, an elderly man who had the look of someone who'd long ago stopped being surprised, listened to both sides. My testimony was simple. I described the night in, the footage, the notes, the change in the neighborhood's tenor. I didn't embellish. I told the truth the way surveyors tell coordinates, plainly, with reference points. Marlene testified in kind, painting herself as a guardian who had been misunderstood. There were moments of real tension. At one point she said, "I did this because I care," and a neighbor in the back muttered something about control. The judge asked pointed questions about authority, about documented consent for inspections, about bylaws. The decision, when it came, was procedural but decisive. The court found that the board had overstepped in not providing adequate oversight of Marlene's inspections and that entering a homeowner's property without explicit permission crossed a line. The injunction was limited. It prohibited board members from conducting unannounced inspections and required the association to revise its policies to prevent unilateral enforcement. It also required Marlene to undergo a cooling-off period and to participate in mediation. It felt like a small victory scaled up by months of anxiety. But victories never come without consequences. Public decisions create public scars. Some people felt vindicated, others felt betrayed. Marlene, in the days after the hearing, packed up and sold her house. She left with a box of lamps and a letter she'd written to the board, dramatic and righteous. She moved downstate. People wrote op-eds in the neighborhood group about bully culture and governance. Our community charted a new course, new bylaws, clearer enforcement protocols, a committee that had rotation so power couldn't concentrate in one pair of hands. Recovery was slow. It felt like a neighborhood coming back from a storm, branches down, some fences leaning, a few gardens that had been trampled. The work of rebuilding trust required small, repetitious acts, returning a casserole, mowing an elderly neighbor's lawn, lending a ladder. Laura and I sat on our swing one evening as cicadas sang, and we watched a kid from down the block kick a ball in the street. The noise was ordinary and glorious. It felt like something earned. I don't pretend everything is perfect. There are still emails, the occasional petty complaint, the odd tense meeting. Power is always trying to concentrate. But Cedar Hollow now had language for limits and procedures that prioritized consent and transparency. New people on the board meant new energies. We voted to allocate a fund for community events instead of enforcement reserves, a small, symbolic choice that felt like the neighborhood reclaiming itself. There's a lesson here that feels both obvious and complicated. Rules alone don't make a community humane. The spirit in which rules are enforced matters more than the rules themselves. When authority is applied as a shield for insecurity, it becomes armor for cruelty. When authority is applied as a tool of care, it can protect, but only with accountability. I think back to that binder. I keep it on a shelf now, not to be vengeful, but to remember how small things can become turbines of conflict. It's a reminder that documentation, careful, calm, methodical, is the antidote to gaslighting. It's also a reminder that legal remedies are blunt instruments. They can resolve disputes, but they rarely mend hearts. If you're listening and you live in a neighborhood with an HOA or anything that feels like an HOA in your life, ask yourself which of these two things you want to be, a steward or a vigilante. Stewardship asks for patience. Vigilantism dresses itself as civic duty and eats the community from the inside. Ask those questions and then ask them again in your own voice. Ask the people who run your community how they would handle a dispute. Ask where they would draw the line. And when someone says they're protecting value, ask, value for whom? I won't pretend I didn't enjoy the moments where the tide turned. I won't pretend I didn't feel a rush when the judge read the injunction or when neighbors came together to volunteer on the new community day. There was gratification, yes, but also a sober recognition that this victory was fragile. It took a lot to get here. Time, money, emotional bandwidth. It wasn't painless. We paid a price. Some neighbors left. Some stayed. Cedar Hollow has new faces now, and with them new stories. The neighborhood knows better how quickly ordinary civility can harden into judgment, and how easily good intentions can turn to control. If there's a final image I want to leave you with, it's this. A little girl, maybe 7, who comes to the yard sale we hold every spring now. She wanders between tables, touches a cracked teacup, picks up a picture frame, and asks if she can have the old baseball glove sitting on a blanket. I see her mother smile and step closer. The mother says, "Of course," and the girl runs off, glove clutched, and the two of them are laughing because the glove smells like someone else's summer, and that's enough. I watched them, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like the neighborhood had turned a corner. That laughter, small and uncompromised, felt like the measure of what we were protecting. So here's what I want to ask you, because these things don't only happen in Cedar Hollow, they happen everywhere. Where does your line fall between order and control? When someone says they're enforcing the rules, do you ask who benefits? When someone says they care, do you ask how they show it? If you've ever watched a community spiral over an arcane rule and wondered what to do, tell me in the comments below what you think should have happened. Do you side with strict enforcement to protect property values? Or do you believe in a gentler, consensus-driven approach? Have you ever been on either side of a dispute like this? I want to hear those stories. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived it or know someone who has, share it. Talk about it at your next block party, at your HOA meeting, in your neighborhood group. And if you think we've overlooked something in nuance, a mistake, let me know. I learn more by listening than I did by fighting. And if you found this interesting, consider leaving a like, Maybe subscribe for more stories about the small fights that reveal a lot about who we are. Hit the comment, share your take on justice, on fairness, on how we should live together. Tell me, is order worth the cost if it erodes the very thing it claims to protect? Tell me your story, because I believe there's a lesson in every house on the block, and sometimes, when we share them, we find a common ground again.